Good morning, everybody, and thank you all for joining us today. I appreciate the opportunity to spend a little time with you. I know everyone's schedules are busy. We have a lot to cover in a short amount of time, so I'll just get right to it. First and foremost, I want to thank C3 Solutions for joining us here in this joint webinar. My name is Tom Pyle. I'm the president of the Institute for Energy Research and my sister advocacy organization, the American Energy Alliance. As I mentioned to our panelists, I've been running IR for 18 years now, so I guess you could call it a career. We sort of view ourselves as a free market, true north compass in the energy and environmental policy debates. We focus on federal, state policies and how they impact people. And more increasingly, how our policies and our production and our generous resources are benefiting the world as well. Today's session is on the record. We're going to record the webinar and we're going to share it on our social media networks and everything else. If anyone has a question, please, for any one of the panelists, myself, please enter it in the Q&A box. Hopefully we'll leave plenty of time for questions and, get right into it. I think this in particular today, we're going to be focusing on what I think is one aspect of what I'm calling a climate lawfare strategy, where we see anti-energy activists who, increasingly frustrated with the progress being made in Washington, have sort of turned to state houses and the courts to advance their agenda. And in particular with this issue of the quote unquote climate superfund laws, of course, one in New York more recently in December of 2024, which requires fossil fuel companies to pay in the tune of $3 billion annually over the next 25 years, and then utilize those resources to fund clean energy projects and other priorities for the state. Vermont passed a similar law in August of 2024. So right now we have two states that are actively trying to implement this climate superfund concept. The basic rationale is that they claim anyway is to hold companies financially accountable for historical contributions to climate change. They're designed in essence to retroactively assign liability and sidestep federal jurisdiction on some of these issues. We always at IR talk about what the real world implications are, and we all know that energy companies generally don't pay for these things. We do. We pay for it in the form of higher gas prices, higher energy prices. And then, of course, this patchwork of these state energy liability regimes are undermining both our security and creating a whole lot of uncertainty for companies, especially here in this country, because they exempt foreign companies from all of this. So we're going to hear from three great panelists today. First, Ian Banks, who's a research fellow at our partner C3 Solutions, who focuses on free market climate policy in particular. Jessica, and how do you say your last name, Jessica? I don't want to butcher it.
Winkle.
Jessica Winkle, thank you, an associate professor at UNC Wilmington. And she's also affiliated with the Breakthrough Institute, which I absolutely love the work that the Breakthrough Institute does. And she's an expert in the intersection of science, policy, and risk. And then lastly, but certainly not least, Donald Cochin. Did I say that right?
Correct. Yes.
Good. Professor of law at George Mason University and the executive director of the Law and Economics Center. So we're pleased to have all of you here to join us. Let me turn it over to first Ian. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much, Tom, and thank you very much for helping C3 to host this. We're very, very excited to get to dig into some of the effects of these laws and the effects, what I will be focusing on in my opening remarks, the effects of these laws on consumers, regardless if they are upheld or struck down. These laws will have significant effects on consumer costs and have a chilling effect on industry and business. Yes. First, just to kind of level set a little bit, these kind of climate superfund laws are very different from Superfunds. Yes, the kind of historical Superfunds. I think I expect that Don will probably get into this a little bit more in detail and just kind of the legal aspects, which is not my specialty. But that the Superfunds kind of the audience might be at least broadly familiar with the term, usually refers to specific, discrete pollution sites that are designated as Superfund sites, and then the costs for cleaning those sites up are borne by the industry or by the responsible parties who are responsible for polluting those sites. These laws are very different from that. Climate change is not a discrete site. It is a global phenomenon. And that's where I'd like to start. I'll be focusing on four themes this morning. First is that climate change is necessarily global and that emissions are global. Second, that we are all emitters. We emit greenhouse gases in our daily life. And third, that the attribution of greenhouse gas emissions to extreme weather events is extremely fraught. And then fourth, and finally, most importantly, that these laws, even if they are struck down, will significantly increase costs for consumers. And so starting that climate change is necessarily global, and so are emissions. That the assessment of trying to assess and attribute the responsibility for climate change is an extremely complicated process, but that there are not discrete, there's not a discrete place where climate change happens. It is happening globally. The climate is global. It's one of the reasons why climate change is the focus of international agreements such as the Paris Accords and the Kyoto Protocol. And so it's important to recognize that this is a global phenomenon, and attempting to one state attempting to take action to mitigate the effects of or remediate the effects of climate change on their state by exacting fees and costs onto companies is in many ways just a carbon tax by another name. It's trying to use a state level policy to create and I guess react to global change, both to you create a fund for the remediation, but also to create disincentives for companies to invest in fossil fuels, and for these the companies that are will be liable under these funds to divest from fossil fuels because they are being held liable for these historical emissions. And second, that we are all responsible for emissions. It's important to note that while the laws name a few companies for producing, for their responsibility in producing fossil fuel products that would eventually go on to be create emissions, we are the ones, because we being the whole global community, but particularly those of us who have interacted in the economy of New York or Vermont over the past 30 years, we are the ones who are responsible for creating those emissions. We're the ones who are burning those fossil fuels in our cars. We're the ones who are using those fossil fuels to create electricity to light and heat our homes. It's fossil fuels have been an essential part of our way of life for centuries now, and we have to take seriously that this was that fossil fuels. These companies were creating a very useful product, a quality product that was in significant demand, and that there will be debates about how liable those companies can be for the information that should be known. But as I'll get to now, is that it's trying to assess the attribution of specific weather events, extreme weather events, to climate change is very, very fraught. I expect that Jessica will talk a lot about this. This is her specialty, but that it is there are tremendous uncertainties and vast assumptions that go into modeling weather, that go into modeling the climate, and then that go into the economic models that these events are plugged into. And so trying to make connections between the attribution of extreme weather events to specific climate, and then even more granularly to specific emitters is nearly impossible and rests on these vast assumptions, assumptions which frequently are politically or and necessarily politically informed and appropriately so, but that those because those assumptions are politically informed and oftentimes politically motivated, that means that the companies that will be deemed liable, there's a political aspect to that liability. And then finally, these laws will increase costs for consumers, regardless as if they're struck down. If they stand, if they're found to stand, which seems unlikely, there's a lot of challenges that I'm looking forward to hearing Donald enumerate in both his remarks and in our Q&A. But that regardless of the challenges, these laws are already going to increase costs. They are clearly increasing the what's referred to as policy risk of these fossil fuel companies. Policy risk is the component. So there's the sort of normal technology risk of investment, or I guess where a technology could fail, and then that would increase the risk of a company failing. Policy risk is the exposure of a company to changes in policy that would negatively impact the company or cause the company to fail. These are obviously controllable risks. Policies doesn't happen in a vacuum, and it doesn't happen arbitrarily. It's actions taken by policymakers, and policymakers in New York and Vermont and in other states which have introduced legislation that mirrors these. This legislation creates risks. Investors are concerned that if this legislation is found to hold up, then these companies are going to have to pay billions of dollars. That is going to discourage these companies from continuing to take actions in these states that have passed these laws. So it's going to increase costs, particularly for consumers in New York and Vermont, but will increase costs for the rest of Americans as well. Likely these costs will get passed on. The cost of the fees themselves will get passed on to consumers. And just kind of quick back of the envelope map I was doing just before this is if this 75 billion in New York alone, if that defrayed over 25 years, gets passed on to consumers across the entirety of the US, that's an additional 2 cents per gallon, 2.1 cents per gallon of gas for every single American over the next 25 years. And 2 cents a gallon is not massive, but it is, looking over that time period, that is a really dramatic cost to Americans. And that's only the cost of the fee itself. That doesn't include the cost that we will see because of the discouragement of investing in energy infrastructure. Today, whether you want to talk about artificial intelligence, the electrification of vehicles, or if you look at any metric, particularly industrial manufacturing, electricity and energy costs are one of the most significant concerns of Americans today. And we desperately need the infrastructure to build more energy, and we desperately need more energy production. And so we need more energy production, and then we need more transportative energy. Both of these things require tremendous amounts of investment, and these laws, whether they stand up or are struck down, discourage investment in energy infrastructure, which will significantly increase costs, not very much in the near term, but as we get into periods, years of increased energy demand, will dramatically increase the costs for consumers. And so we need to be very wary of these laws, whether they stand up or get struck down. And so that's what I'd like to kind of focus on, is that these laws increase costs regardless of their status. Thank you very much. Oh, Tom, I think you're on mute.
So, thank you. And I'm supposed to wait for the questions, but one came up specifically for you. The question is Professor Joseph Stiglitz wrote a letter to the Governor Hochul that argued that the 75 billion would not be passed on to consumers. How do you respond to that?
So Professor Stiglitz, Nobel laureate, brilliant man. I think it is unlikely that all of the costs would get passed on to consumers. Most models don't show that. For most costs, even if we look at tariffs right now, costs don't seem to be passed directly onto consumers in their totality. But to say that these costs would not get passed on to consumers in any way, that would not have a significant impact on consumers, seems very unlikely and out of would go in the opposite direction of economic models and economic history. And I think there's clear evidence that when you increase costs for business, that increases costs for consumers. And particularly when it is, whether you're looking at the direct cost of the 75 billion, but I think also most importantly, looking at long-term costs of capital expenditures on infrastructure upgrades.
Yeah, so the industry is not going to just take one for the team, I guess, right?
No,
So,
no. Industry is necessarily and importantly self-motivated. I
yeah,
mean, profit and yes, selfishness is a virtue in capitalism, and industry is going to be selfish on this one.
yeah. Thank you so much, Ian. Jessica, the floor is yours.
Well, well, thank you also for having me here. This was a nice surprise in my inbox to get this invite. I'd say that what first interests me in all of this, and still sort of is fascinating to me, is that what's actually being pursued is damages to address disaster losses, right? Which are necessarily a product of the built environment. And in areas sometimes where the infrastructure is known to be aging, and in dire need of repair. And so there's this pursuit of litigation to provide the funds to address what is ultimately a rather significant infrastructure issue and policy issue, right? Which has not really been dealt with over the years. So your losses are a product of the built infrastructure and then socioeconomic trends. And so anything that, and overwhelmingly so, and you're seeing this play out in debates about insurance as well, where a lot of what we're experiencing is in insurance costs and in disaster losses is being attributed to climate change, when it is really ultimately in large part the built environment and how we're handling that. So I think it's I think redirecting to litigation and to fossil fuel companies and to a history of economic development really, it displaces the responsibility that should be better placed on policymakers. So they're effectively displacing it onto the courts. And I think that's seriously problematic, not only for functional urban environments into the next century, for addressing the real world problem that we have with disaster costs, but also for, I would say, taking responsibility for the different branches, I guess you could say, some of the problems that we're having in government now. So that's what sort of drew me to this whole thing to begin with. There's other issues that are coming up. You guys had mentioned some of the issues dealing with climate science. I would say that a long-term issue is that the methods, like the extreme event attribution method or methods, that a lot of this has come to be rooted on, a lot of the litigation has come to be rooted on, has become a professionalized, right? So there are people that do it. There are people that train other people to do it. It's sort of celebrated within certain colleges. And so you're seeing like a professionalization of this practice. And the merits of that practice are debated significantly and are highly controversial. I think there are serious ethical concerns about it, given that the whole methodological pursuit was born by the want to pursue litigation, and then the realm of choice that's available in in putting these things together. But I think that if you have generations, what is now happening of students, of happening where you're having a profession and then students being taught and then it going forth into what has become a field, is somewhat problematic. Like, it's not going to go away on its own. So that is a quick rundown of a lot of the things that I find interesting about what's going on in this field and why I started looking at it.
Very good. Quick question for you. One of the things that my assertion about these is that it's more politically driven, like the methodologies for assigning liability. I don't see this as scientifically rigorous. Emissions obviously result from all activity, not just one particular group of emitters, if you will. This is a global issue, and consumers play a role. Like, they choose these products, right? But yet they're not on the hook either. So can you talk a little bit about sort of do you agree? And if not, then, what are your thoughts on the rigorousness of the science here?
I think I guess my opinion from what I've seen is that it's very squishy because of the way that and I wish I could recite the protocol, quote unquote, to you offhand. But I cannot. But when you look through the different stages, there is a fairly large range of choice to be had in it. So one example is, what's your study area? Where's your area that you're looking at that's going to be the kind of like the effect area? Is it small? Is it larger? But it turns out that that the methodology itself is very sensitive to that decision. So if you're in the business of providing evidence for litigation, then that would presumably lead into the way that you define your study area. The other thing that's really interesting about that methodology or the protocol is that it is designed quite explicitly to feed into like a media spin, a media cycle. So you're so it's not just, okay, you're going to do the study, but you're also going to communicate the study, and you're going to communicate it rapidly, right? And I think that there's a lot of ways where it starts to depart from scientific norms. One argument has been that to strengthen it would be some sort of pre-registration process. So you set out your sort of methodology or what you're actually going to test for before you go through it. And so you have some sort of before and after, rather than going through the process sort of behind the scenes and then start disseminating messages on it. While what has actually been done, or the decisions, why some decisions were made over others, is very black boxed. So yeah.
Got it.
Leave it at that.
Yeah, thank you. Donald, take it from here.
Excellent. Well, thank you to IER and to C3 Solutions and to all my panelists for being part of this. I'm going to proceed on 3 points. One, I want to pick up something on the cost issue that was just raised as from one of the questions. The second is just to expand upon what Ian said about the fact that these are conveniently labeled superfunds to try to deflect and to legitimize an otherwise illegitimate wealth transfer. And then the third is to begin to highlight some of the legal challenges that are here. But I think that we're also going to get into some of that in the Q&A. So I'll just survey those and leave it for deeper questions as we go along. On the cost issue, the first thing I'll say is please stay tuned. I know some economists are working on on some studies studies to evaluate the Stiglitz claims and to also show why some of the assumptions are faulty and don't stand up. I'll just kind of give you a brief, a few things to think about in that realm. One is that, basically what Stiglitz is saying is this idea that if the oil companies could charge more prices, they already would be. And so the idea is there's no place to go. There's no place up to go. But that static idea may be true related to current supplies, but the marginal cost and demand curve changes when the costs go up for future production that ultimately would to account for some of these costs, which means the demand will stay steady, but the supply will go down, and that competitive supply going down will drive prices up all over the place. So there's various ways in which that static model just doesn't work when you're looking at a dynamic market and long-term changes in supply that might be occurring in part just due to the cost, but also occurring in part because of some of the innovative and investment effects that Ian already has pointed out. The second thing is that I think that that claim doesn't take into account the effect on consumers, not as consumers, but as on other participants in the marketplace. So these are folks who are in fact invested in these companies, either through their mutual funds, through their 401ks, through their pension funds. And so there's a large number of individuals that even if you say that the cost could be borne by the companies themselves, that will lead to lower dividends overall, lower stock prices, and otherwise have impacts on all of those funds. So the dynamic effect to the market itself and to individuals as investors is going to be significant as a result of subsuming some of these costs. So to say that this can you can have it completely free is really I think just looking at too simplistic a model overall. And then lastly, there's this idea of uncertainty costs that are built in whenever you have retroactive liability. This is going to have an impact across not just the energy sector, but across sectors that are of lawful goods all across the country. That is, people can't depend on a rule of law, which makes investment go down overall, which has effects on the overall economy for all kinds of industries and all kinds of products. If this can happen to the energy industry, it can happen to anyone, in which we just say that retroactively some lawful product can now be deemed as subject to a fine-like structure years later. That means that people just don't have confidence in some of their investments and the possibility of return on investments that they're making today, because I don't know what my liability is going to be tomorrow. When I get to the legal arguments, I'll point out one of the main reasons why we have the rule of law and due process and the idea of knowability of law is so that people can adjust their behavior, they can adjust their investments in an anticipation and reasonable expectation of return. And once you disrupt that system and say that there really is no rule of law constraint on that expectation of return, and that later in time you can be subject to liability for a purely lawful action, that is not good for overall market investment, and that's going to be market wide, not limited to just one particular sector. So the rule of law has very important consequences for the market. So that's the first point. The second thing I want to focus on is this labeling of Superfund, and I think some of these points have already started to be made. But Superfund was a system in which there were a lot of contaminated sites that we felt we needed some way in order to clean those up. They were isolated, though, to specific sites, not to a global ecosystem, not to a global an environment. And so you would identify a very discrete site and you would say, this place needs cleaning up. That's not happening with these. This is about sort of some kind of overall transboundary problem. You would actually do work on that specific site. It wasn't creating a slush fund that could be used anywhere for anything or be used for alternative environmental good activity, but instead it was dedicated funding to go directly at that discrete site, and the funding was determined, the amount of liability was determined in direct consequence to the effects. None of that is being claimed to be done by these legislatures here. They're just saying there are some kind of undiscernible effects that we should just create a fund to pay for. There's all kinds of other reasons why these are not Superfunds. I'll just mention a couple more. One is that there's nothing, as I mentioned, nothing remediated here. One of the reasons why the Superfund laws have been upheld over time is because they were seen as someone would incur costs associated directly with some kind of culpable activity. There would be then remediation, and the remediation would limit the costs overall, rather than having sort of this open-ended liability fund, which maybe 75 billion today, it could be 150 $150 billion across other energy companies later. The second is that it did focus on the actual wrongdoer polluters, or in this sense, the contaminators, or the people who are deemed to be wrongdoers. This is going after people who produce energy largely, and not after the people who are actually, as Ian pointed out, all of us are polluters in this sense. And so we're not brought into that scheme. In a Superfund scheme, there's something known as a potentially responsible party. And so even if EPA demands that one person clean up a contaminated site and can order that to be done, that person can thereafter go after other PRPs, the people who actually polluted the land, and get contribution for the action that they cleaned up. So that ultimately, it may take many years and it may be very difficult, but ultimately the scheme is set up so that the money shifts, and ultimately the person who actually did the contamination would be responsible for this. None of that kind of direct responsibility mechanism exists here, which is why I think it opens these up to even, to not a comparison, and instead any of the defenses, the legal defenses that might have existed for Superfund or might exist for Superfund just don't graft on to these so-called climate Superfund laws or so-called polluter pay laws, because they are neither. And I believe that they were largely, these labels were done for convenience sake, to try and legitimize the legislation and to try and make it sound like it wasn't such a deviation from norms to do this kind of thing, and also a way to sort of mask or insulate from criticism or a close look by saying, oh no, this is just something we've always done. Don't look here, right? So these are not the drones you're looking for kind of idea. That this is not as scary as it might seem. So let's get into that a little bit about what exactly are some of the legal complications with this, and then I'll certainly turn it back to you to see which areas you want to delve into in more detail. So these are state-based legislative laws, and they are largely coming as part of an overall, whether it be climate warfare, lawfare, or you might call it the climate liability ecosystem. For at least 15 years now, there's been a concentrated effort to find different legal avenues to hold energy companies liable for climate change, or so-called climate change problems and remediation. And so what you've seen is various iterations of litigation that has failed, and then there's a new strategy implemented, and then that fails and there's a new strategy implemented. And I could go on for a long time telling that whole history, but ultimately what we've gotten to today is that there's some very innovative entrepreneurial individuals in the space that have decided, oh, here's a new idea to impose liability, where we're seeing a lot of potential defeats and actual defeats in courts when we're trying to bring these climate change litigation strategies, when we're trying to bring public nuisance, et cetera. So why don't we, instead of having to go through the difficult process of proving a causation and proving liability in a court system, why don't we just deem them liable and slap a fine directly on them and do what the courts are incapable of doing? But the courts are incapable of doing it because they require that you actually identify a wrong, you identify that there's causation and traceability to the particular defendant, and then you can limit that liability to the specific thing proven in those other things. That's difficult. We mean for liability to be difficult in our system of justice, and it's not meant to have an end run around by the legislature just saying, no, don't worry, you don't have to go through the court system to establish liability here. We'll just do it directly by fiat through legislation. Our separation of powers is never allowed for that kind of thing, and doesn't allow for it here. So that's in part what the concern should be, is looking at it in the overall environment. This is a reactive strategy to losing in court. And if every time you lose in court and can't actually prove that someone is responsible for something, you could just go to the legislature and say, hey, why don't you just deem them responsible without any proof? That's a really dangerous change and shift in our democratic and Republican values. Republican small are there. So some of the most direct challenges that are going to come, that's sort of the big picture concern about all of this. But some of the direct challenges are that states are not meant to be able to should not be allowed to operate in this space as a result of congressional and Congress has taken over the space. This doctrine is typically called preemption. That is, that when Congress chooses to enter a particular field and does so in a comprehensive way, like it has under the Clean Air Act, and it's done it in a way which is balanced very important important competing concerns. It's balanced environmental concerns with feasibility concerns, with economic concerns, with development and innovation concerns, with our energy requirement concerns, with consumer demand concerns. All of those things are complex issues that only legislatures can actually do well. And only the federal government can do it well in terms of a transboundary, in fact, a global issue that requires that kind of balancing and competing, creation of a uniform system across the country. So when Congress enters a particular space that it is allowed to enter and does so in such a comprehensive manner, it leaves very little room for the states to operate in those areas. And that's what we call preemption as a legal doctrine. And that's what's being litigated in the cases that are being brought right now. That's the primary claim, is that the Clean Air Act is doing the work. You cannot graft onto it additional requirements. You certainly can't graft onto it 50 different requirements. And the 50 different requirements, by the way, have no guarantee of being consistent. You could have highly inconsistent, not only between the states and the federal government requirements for energy production, but you could have 50 different requirements. It would cripple any industry that's trying to comply with such a complex regime. And so preemption is really saying, look, once the federal government has stepped in, states, you are not allowed to step in, and this legislation crosses that boundary and causes a problem there. There are additional arguments that can be made. The next strongest one is probably this idea of retroactivity and retroactive liability. That is that the due process, grounded in the rule of law, due process of law clause requires that legislation be prospective in nature. It also requires that individuals have fair notice of what is and is not illegal at the time, or is not subject to an individual to liability at the time they act. Here you're saying they're going back decades and saying those things that we told you were entirely lawful, those things that we as states, by the way, purchased a lot of those products ourselves, those things that we as states encouraged you to do through various types of legislative encouragements, and certainly those things that the consumers in our states demanded, we're now going to deem those retroactively a wrong that subjects you to liability. That kind of retroactivity is just not allowed in our system. The rule of law requires that people be able to know what the rules of the game are, and therefore to be able to adjust their behavior according to the rules of the game. And so retroactive liability is often a big problem, and that I think is something which they will be stuck dealing with here. The fact that other due process concerns include the fact that it's thrown out this need for proof of traceability, trace of causation, all things that we say defendants, you should only be liable for actions in courts if indeed it is traceable and provable that you caused this actual activity, that allocability and proportionate liability, that we allocate it directly to you, that there be fair and consistent and equal justice is all part of the due process clause as well, not sort of foreign countries because we're worried that they might have foreign sovereign immunity or other things. We're not going to, nationalized industries are not going to be subject to our bills like the exemptions in these bills. So this is a real problem from the due process clause stance. And then the last thing I'll say is that there's some other potential challenges under things like the Dormant Commerce Clause, which does not allow one state to regulate activities in another state. This is a clause which is controversial in some ways, difficult to prove in the courts. I'm not going to admit that one's a slam. I'm not going to say that one's a slam dunk, but it is certainly against the spirit of the laws to say that one state can control the activities in any other states. So I'll stop there, but these are highly arbitrary decisions that are being made by the legislature. Legislatures are not supposed to be arbitrary, and there's a lot of room for constitutional challenge. And I know that we have a few cases that are doing that I'm sure we'll discuss.
That's great. Thank you so much for that. And it kind of leads me to a question that I have. We kind of chatted about it a little bit before we got on with our guests, but I assume that the proponents of these efforts have pretty smart lawyers as well that they're working with. And you laid out some pretty strong arguments for why these things are going to have trouble working their way through, fruition. If they know what we know and and they assume these things are going to get struck down, what's the end goal for this from your perspective? I mean, you can't be in their heads, but what do you think their motivation is, knowing that they got a hell of a chance, don't have a hell of a chance to survive some of the legal scrutiny?
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure that they don't think they have a chance. At least in the litigation space where they've been litigating the climate change issue and trying to hold energy companies liable under public nuisance and other theories, they've been. I think they truly believe that there is not a preemption argument available under the Clean Air Act. That the Clean Air Act allows room for the states to do these things. They at least want to test it. And one problem with that is in the litigation space that the Supreme Court in AEP versus Connecticut back in 2011 clearly said that there was no federal common law claims for public nuisance here, and that the Clean Air Act displaced federal common law. The claim there is that somehow, because courts don't say more than they have to, and the Supreme Court is very conservative in that way. They try not to say more than they need to, but that sometimes gets them in trouble. And what's happened here is there's this claim that, oh, what they meant then is that states are free to regulate this, despite the fact that all the reasons why federal common law was preempted by the Clean Air Act equally apply to state legislation as well as to state litigation, which would interfere with the ability for the Clean Air Act to operate in a uniform capacity. It would interfere with sort of the discretion that the federal government has to make these kinds of geopolitical decisions. And so I think they may just think they have a winning case.
Okay, interesting. And then, I do know that the Trump administration, there's some folks, attendees who are from the administration, has weighed in on this as well, through an EO and some other directives. The DOJ sued both New York and Vermont, calling the Superfunds a, quote, brazen attempt to grab power from the federal government, and questions about state authority as well between the Trump administration and this, for anybody, shouldn't other states be worried about this?
Well, I'll just jump in really quickly. I think the states should be, and a number of them are. So there's a lawsuit against the Vermont law that was brought by the Chamber of Commerce and API that I believe it was 22 states have intervened in. There is a separate case that is being brought against New York, and I think the number of states there is about an equal number of states that are suing on this. I agree with you, though. I don't understand why more states are not interested in this, because it really is something which will affect the consumers and investors throughout the country.
Sure. Okay, and I encourage panelists, or attendees, I should say, to submit any questions you have through the Q&A box. One from Kevin Kelo. The developers of the attribution discipline over at World Weather Attribution have not been secretive about their aims. Friedrich Otto, for example, is very open about her opposition to fossil fuels, and that attribution science is being developed to win lawsuits against oil companies. How much could the well-documented politicized nature of the science support legal challenges to Superfund laws? That might be Jessica.
So I agree. She has been not shy about the intent and what she's doing in leading the group. I think there could be, and so this is where it goes from like the science to the law, and I'm really uncomfortable with the law part because I'm not a lawyer. But there are some interesting aspects to it when there's a large part of discussion about litigation generated science, and and how that is used in the courts, and whether or not that matters. So from a sort of a philosophical context, the conflicts of interest of litigation generated science is no different from any other conflict of interest generated science. But my understanding is it does matter in a court context. So maybe Donald can inform on that.
Yeah, so it certainly is going to matter. I don't know these particular examples. I can't speak to the motivations there, but I do know that there is a lot of this generation ever since sort of there was a La Jolla conference back in 2012 that really said, "Hey, we need to figure out and create some science that we can use in the courtroom." So this has been a motivation as an assist to the court strategy for a long time. And in the courts certainly. The thing is, in all the climate litigation, we've not yet gotten to the trial stage in any of these cases, which means that we've not yet gotten to where the plaintiffs actually have to prove traceability, causation, and harm and effect. And so when we do get to that stage, then yes, the admissibility of expert testimony standards and the scientific evidence standards and scientific methodology demands in the courtroom should keep this science out, and the motivation should become a factor that the judges determine under their general obligations in both federal courts and in state courts. The judge has an obligation to act as a gatekeeper against introduction of that kind of science. And that's why I think that there will be a very, very difficult road for all the plaintiffs in the climate change litigation to ever win. I mean, they can win in the sense that they have leverage and try to sue if they get that far. But if it ever got to actually having to prove their claims, I think that those cases would fail. The problem is it's going to be a really expensive and long, drawn-out process if the courts allow that to happen. There's plenty of reasons why the courts should be dismissing these cases before it ever gets there, just on a failure to state a claim upon which relief can be granted. So that's in the courtroom. Now, in the legislature, when the court is reviewing the adequacy of policymaking determinations, I think this isn't going to matter as much. I mean, the legislature pretty much is free to accept, the worst kind of arguments in favor of legislation. The courts won't be looking past that to say, oh, this was a bad policy decision. So really in the court challenges to the legislation, the Superfund Acts or the so-called Superfund Acts, those I don't think it's going to matter as much because that's just going to be invalidating these things on purely legal grounds rather than on the factual support.
Great. Someone else chimed in with a science question. Can't the science that fossil fuel harm attribution equals zero be used to challenge the New York and Vermont laws and the 28 state tort cases based on CO2 physics by Professors Lindzen and Happer that CO2 cannot cause extreme weather and global warming?
I mean, ultimately, I think this is where that's going to be persuasive. That should be the kind of thing that causes legislatures to think twice about enacting these kinds of laws. That should be something that constituents are pointing out to the legislatures that they understand about the limits of the science. Whether or not it can be sort of the smoking gun or the nail in the coffin kind of idea, or if I can come up with more metaphors, I don't think so. It's really a matter of persuasion rather than the way in which you're going to be able to invalidate them in court.
Got it. Thank
So,
you.
so can I add to that a little bit?
Please go ahead, Jessica.
Not directly, but sort of context-wise. It is, so while this is going on, while none of it has gone to trial and you haven't had to look at the extreme event attribution methodology and all that in a courtroom, in the meantime, there's a rather significant public advocacy campaign going on. And it's in the media that there's that these things are linked, right? Climate change and all of our experiences with disasters or let's say anthropogenic warming and disasters. There is, and that's a constant message. And then you have Climate Central, who was also very pivotal in bringing world weather attribution to life. And they're running graphics and messaging in a lot of news media and weather reporting. And so it's a more or less a constant messaging that's going on online, in households, everywhere. And to the extent that people have the news on all the time in the background, my feeling is that you also have children growing up learning to learn, like hearing this, right? So among some scientists, one of the some researchers, one of the goals is just a norms change. So it's the constant messaging. And so the way I see it in the classroom is, even though that I can have students read material from the IPCC and say, wow, that does not align at all with what I'm hearing in the news. This is so interesting. It's changed my worldview. By the end of the class, they're still repeating what they've heard, because it's sort of like, I mean, I've been guilty of it too. It's just like a constant, it's like anything that's constant, right? You start repeating it. And so that's a serious challenge in trying to get people past what they're hearing and seeing everywhere to what's actually going on in scientific information, in scientific circles, the relationship between research and philanthropic groups and advocacy groups, and tracking that down. It's a challenge because people continually revert back to the heuristic of what they've been hearing in the news for years. It's going to be hard.
I think that's an excellent point. I want to revise one thing I said, and that is, I actually can think of a way in which these kinds of scientific problems or problems with the science can be introduced. And that is that if every state was able to pick its own standard scientifically and apply its own evidence, that would further thwart the idea that Congress has made some of those scientific determinations on its own through the Clean Air Act. So in the preemption argument, I could see a way in which this comes in and says, look, Congress has already evaluated this. If you are going to sort of say that that the balance has to be struck differently based on different science, that's further ways in which you are impeding the federal prerogative in this space.
I'd also love to just kind of build on that a little bit, where, so I think, kind of focused on what you're saying, Donald, just about some of the the challenges of these laws, and kind of why are they, I guess you asked Tom, if they proponents of the laws have great lawyers and there's likely lots of challenges, why are they still bringing these? I think one of the reasons is this cultural argument that you were just talking about, Jessica, that these laws are not happening in a vacuum. They are like, I think there's a real desire to have these laws passed, like these laws have passed, but to see these laws enacted in such a way that they do lead to some of the effects that we are worried about, but that, like, I guess are desired, but that another additional desire is to see this cultural connection between the sort of historical pollutants and polluters. Like, these are like this, like, you have this image of the like Superfund site where you have like toxic waste spilled all over the place and empty oil drums, et cetera. And like have that exact same image associated with climate change and I guess fossil fuel companies, and trying to make that connection in both the legal sphere, but also kind of it is a product of this cultural campaign, kind of media campaign, but it is also a part of a broader cultural and media campaign to try and drive a narrative that is villainizing energy producers.
And Ian, I think that what they get out of that by changing that culture is they're purchasing leverage, and that leverage has payouts in a variety of places. They get more leverage in terms of trying to pressure settlements and litigation. They get more leverage in terms of trying to get exactions or concessions out of industry to do things that are unnecessary and perhaps not cost effective. And so I think that you've hit it right there on the head.
Yeah, as a father of three, I understand the impact of these narratives. Trust me, 3 teenagers. So I wanted to stay on the messaging. This was going to be my close question, but and I'll try to there's one more in the queue. So far, we've labeled this webinar Climate Change Superfund Act. We've talked about it. We've used the air quotes of so-called. We've talked about what they're trying to do to sort of link the imagery of the Superfund laws. What do we call them? What's our name for them? Because we're just, again, sort of responding to they're so good at labeling and sort of driving that, and then we just sort of adopt their language. So I guess maybe it's a homework assignment for you guys to help me come up with a new name for these things.
I was thinking about this as I was like thinking about planning and helping prepare for this. But the one of the labels I've started to land on is retroactive climate liability. It's not as pithy as Superfund, climate Superfund, but it's I think emphasizes the legal challenges here that this is retroactive. We're trying to punish companies for perfectly legal and very beneficial actions that they took 30 years ago. So I think retroactive climate liability is that's my current working title, but I think we need to keep workshopping it.
Oh, I got one that suggested retroactive energy tax. So there you go. I'm more the attendees can play this game as well if you'd like to chime in.
Yeah, if you crowdsource it, you're going to get some good ideas, I bet.
While we're at it, one last question in the queue, and then we can wrap up. The actual polluters are individual persons who use the fuels, like drivers of cars. Does that impact the viability of this law?
I think it does in the sense that from the due process arguments and from the retroactivity arguments and from the comparison to Superfund ideas is that you are not, you can, the government has been able to get away with some retroactive looking legislation in the past that is actually targeted at clearly identifiable wrongdoers who are the actual contaminators, like on Superfund. That's not what's happening here. So that question goes to the fact that since those aren't the people you're actually going after and just saying you've always known it was wrong to do this one thing, I think that changes things.
I would also add to that oh sorry, Tom.
I was going to say the state of New York purchases a lot of automobiles and trucks and uses a lot of energy, I would assume, right? But they somehow have shielded themselves from any of the responsibility. So
I think
anyway.
Vermont is an interesting case study in this because they they rely quite a bit on oil and fossil fuels for heating in the winter because it's very cold there. So, my understanding is they don't have a whole lot of alternatives, right? They have like one nuclear power plant. They get a lot of hydro energy from Canada, and that's about it. And so, what do they expect to be doing for the winters? Should all this go in their favor, right? And they start winning these lawsuits. Like, it's a very curious phenomenon, like a curious position that some of the states are putting themselves in.
Curiouser and curiouser. Okay, we are 2 minutes out. With the time that's left, there was actually one more crowdsourced false science climate superfund laws. So there's another one to ponder. The last minute or so, you guys all have about 30 seconds each. Give us your best and final. What do you want us to all leave with here?
Starting that these laws, regardless if they are found to be held up, will increase costs for consumers and will decrease our energy security, increase the fragility of our energy infrastructure and energy system, and are extremely dangerous for those reasons.
Great. Donald, Jessica?
I'll chime in. I think that one label you might come up with is something with the word confiscatory in it as well. So it's a confiscatory energy tax. And I do wonder about one thing which I didn't say yet, which is the exemption of foreign entities from some of these state laws may very well be because under bilateral treaty agreements, there are provisions that make us liable if we confiscate resources. And those are actually more enforceable than our takings clause as it's been currently interpreted. So that could very well be why you said, why are they why are they crafting the legislation the way they are? They may have more confidence in the claims that they have in front of our federal courts based on the Constitution than they think they have on basis of bilateral agreements. So this is pure out confiscation for legal activity. It is not consistent with our rule of law values. And it also is not consistent in a system of federalism, in which we do. In our system of federalism, we commit certain things to the federal government for good reasons. And this is one of them.
Great. Jessica.
I guess I would say like more, I think the big picture of what this is doing, I think, to science itself, and then what the shaping of our understanding of our energy needs and interests, and potentially also geopolitically, as some of the stuff has been coming up in international courts, and the effort to shape that to pursue these sorts of energy ideals that some people have, and what that means for our relationships kind of on the world stage. So if it's not while the winning of the litigation may be like sort of like a consolation prize, if the real interest is sort of the messaging and the larger social endeavor, that seems to have somehow that's very concerning to me. And I think that is of concern to a lot of people, and really the main issue almost.
Excellent. Well, thank you all very much. Appreciate it. Thank you, C3, for co-hosting.
Absolutely.
Really helpful, and I hope our attendees got some good information out of that. And I will close with by saying that I hope that the kids that think this is important realize that they're the ones who are probably going to end up paying for it. So, anyways, thank you all very much. Thanks to the attendees. We'll be doing this again sometime soon. I appreciate it. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Thanks,
Yep.
everyone.
Bye.